Hi everyone, welcome to the Microbiology week of MD5027. This is the first lecture of the week, and the purpose of this lecture is to introduce and provide information on the assessment. Obviously the assessment is hugely important, so we want to just enter the week straight away making sure you understand the assessment and you know what is expected of you for the assessment. The assessment itself is a case study, or rather it's a case report of a case study. So we're focusing on a specific case study and you are writing a report of that case study. Now, to write that report, you need to access the materials that are on the module space, and to understand those materials on the module space, you'll need to watch these pre-recorded lectures. So that's how everything fits together. If you go to the Microbiology tab on the MD5027 module space, you'll see the resources that I'm talking about there. You'll see a number of different folders named case study resources. And in these folders, there are things like lab test results. There are things like information histories on individuals that are potentially involved in the case study. You'll see population data, and this is all information that's about the case study. This is all information that's there to help you understand this case study, and this is information that you're going to interpret and understand, and you're going to write a report on for the assessment for this module. Now currently it just looks like a bunch of information, so obviously there needs to be assistance to help you understand that information, and that's what the taught sessions are. So there's a range of pre-recorded lectures on the Microbiology tab as well. You'll see them towards the bottom of the list, and what you need to do is go through these lectures one by one, listen to them, take notes, really understand them, because the information from these lectures is designed to help you understand the case study resources. And obviously if you want to write a successful and effective case report on the case study, you need to understand those case study resources, you need to understand the lab test results, you need to understand the population data, you need to understand how to interpret the patient information, the kind of histories that have been given on these individuals. And again, the way to do that is to listen to and understand the lecture content that myself and Kate have provided. You'll also see at the top of the Microbiology tab, there are a few PDFs, so a few documents that are giving an outline of the case study. Really important that you access these as well. So this is your introductory information. So before you start going into the case study resources, before you start watching all the other lectures, I strongly suggest you look at the 3 PDFs at the top of the Microbiology tab, because what these do is provide a little bit of context. They explain the case study in a general way, and then obviously when you understand the case study in a general way, you'll be prepared to go into things in more detail, to start going into the lecture content and also looking in more detail at the case study resources. And these case study resources, they're not straightforward. There's a lot of information there. This is a big chunk of your assessment for the modules, so it should be challenging, and it is challenging. Students found it challenging last year. They also found it really enjoyable, because this is the kind of learning that students tend to find enjoyable: problem solving, looking through resources, interpreting it in an intelligent way, doing outside reading and pulling that in. Again, this is level 5 now, so we're not really ever asking you to just regurgitate information back to us. In an ideal situation, that's not what we want to be doing. What we want to be doing is kind of exploring your understanding of science and topics in a more in-depth way, and this is one of the ways that we do that, by giving you this information, giving you a problem to solve, giving you some support as you're trying to solve this problem, and then assessing your understanding of the problem. And again, the problem in this context is a case study. So what I'm going to do now is just work through some information that is specifically on the assessment, so that will help you understand what is expected of you with this assessment and help you to understand which resources you should be going to for this and that. One thing I do want to make clear right at the start, and I'll be saying this again later because I really don't want any students to be confused about this, you are not going to be assessed on your practical performance. You are not going to be assessed on anything that you do during the practical session. Okay, so every student should have been scheduled for 1 day of microbiology practical sessions. You're not assessed on that. Nothing you obtain from that day of practical sessions, so no information you derive from the experiments is required for the assessment. It's not expected to be in the assessment. It doesn't need to be in the assessment, so you don't need to put it in your case report. The case report is based upon the information on the module space. The practical sessions is just additional. Okay, that's just the opportunity for you to conduct some lab work, and it is useful, it is very, very valuable, but it's not relevant to the assessment. So we really want to make that 100% clear. Okay, so we'll go through some more information now. So here we have what is essentially an assessment brief for the microbiology portion of the MD5027 assessment. On the left, as you can read, you need to compose a 720-word report based on the case study investigated in the microbiology week of the module. So again, we're focused on a specific case study, and you are submitting a report of this case study, and this report is what is going to be marked. So what should be in this report? Essentially, you should be discussing the case study itself. So you should be using the evidence on the module space, so the lab test result, the patient information, the population data. You should be using this to interpret the case study. So you should be answering questions like, what is the causative agent of the epidemic? Because it's a case study of an epidemic, as you'll see in the module. So what is the causative agent? What is the type of disease? There are 6 different suspected cases. Again, you'll see this in the resources. Are all of these cases attributable to the epidemic? Which ones are attributable? Why do you think some are not attributable? Why do you think the ones that are attributable are attributable? Do the lab test results support this? Do the histories of the individuals support this? Does the population data support this? So this is what you're doing. You're trying to solve the case study. You're trying to find what the causative agent is. What is the disease? What is this epidemic? And you're going to be supporting the arguments you make with the evidence. Again, this evidence is the case study resources on the module space. Now, as we've said, this is level 5, so it's not good enough to be descriptive. We don't want to just say, we think, or you don't want to say a potential causative agent is this because this lab test supports this. It's not. It's just not good enough, really. We need more depth. You need to actually evaluate the information. You need to evaluate the case study resources that are on the module space. So as you'll see with the lab test results, it's not always black and white. So with a lot of lab test results, you're expecting a range, and you'll have a healthy range, and sometimes the results will be maybe in this range but towards the edge of the range, or maybe they'll be outside the range indicating a pathology, but they're only just outside the range. So it's not always black and white, and these are things you can interpret and discuss in your case report. Also things like patient information. So if an individual is reporting a particular behavior, we don't necessarily know that they're telling the truth, or we don't necessarily know that they are recollecting information accurately. So we say individual information can be fallible, there can be mistakes, individuals can misremember. So this is all things you can think about. These are the types of evaluation you can potentially be conducting when you're interpreting the case study resources. And again, when you're reading through the case study resources, when you're looking at the information, and when you're accessing the lectures as well, you'll be getting these ideas of how to evaluate. You'll be thinking of the different limitations of the information that's provided there. And this is something you've done before. So if you look at the lab test results, you'll recognize some of the types of lab tests because they've been talked about before, and you'll be able to think of some of the limitations, either because they've been covered in lectures or because you'll be accessing the wider literature. So you can be looking in textbooks, you can be going on PubMed and looking at research papers, and you can be finding out what are the limitations of these different resources there. We also want to go beyond just explaining what the case study is. So again, initially we want to be looking at the case study, thinking about what is this epidemic. It's a case study of an epidemic. So what is this disease that's hit this population? But we also want to be going further than that. So we want to be thinking about potential interventions. So we want to be thinking about what can we actually do in this situation? what can we recommend? And we're coming from this of the perspective of lab scientists, but from this perspective we have an understanding of how interventions could potentially put into place. So this is what we also want to be thinking about in our case study report. And as with all our suggestions, these suggestions need to be supported by the case study resources, they need to be supported by the literature, they need to be logical, and they need to be supported by our understanding of the science. Here is what your assessment should be structured like. This is how it should look when you submit it. So you should start off with an introduction / overview, then you should have a discussion, then you should have a conclusion. Now in this initial section, the introduction or the overview, you should be outlining your key findings, if you like, or your key arguments. You should be saying exactly what you have determined the causative agent of the epidemic is. You should be saying which cases you feel are attributable to the epidemic. So there's 6 individuals. You should be saying which, if any of those individuals you think are involved in the epidemic, so which are suffering from the particular disease that is the epidemic. And you should also be summarizing your key arguments of what should be done as a step forward. So what interventions should be put in place. And this is the introduction / overview. Then you should move into your discussion, and this is really the meat of the submission. This is really the bulk of it. This is where you're going to discuss exactly how and why you arrived at the arguments that you have just put forth. So you should be discussing exactly how the case study resources and your outside reading and the lecture material information, so information you've obtained from the lecture, you should be discussing how all of this information informed your arguments. So if you have argued that in this case study there is an epidemic that is caused by a particular infectious agent, you need to, here in the discussion, discuss how you arrived at that conclusion. Really, you need to discuss which lab tests, which information, which bits of population data, which bits of patient histories actually support the arguments that you've made. You need to be looking at the literature and need to be getting ideas from there as well. Crucially, this is where you're going to be putting in that evaluation, because as I said, it's not always going to be black and white. There's going to be interpretations that might not be, you might not be 100% confident of your interpretations of some of the pieces of data, and that's absolutely fine. You just need to be upfront about that, and you need to say, I have interpreted this, or this has been interpreted in this way, however, there is this issue. Okay, however, there is this limitation. So you're interpreting it in a particular way, but you are tempering that with some evaluation, and you are showing that you are able to discuss in an intelligent way and you have an insightful understanding of the lab tests. And again, this is the discussion. Finally, you have your conclusion, and conclusion, really, really short. You should just have a key summary of the whole submission. So just a very concise, clean summary of the key bits of information, of the key arguments you've made in the submission. Okay, so hopefully that's been really useful information. Hopefully you have a good understanding of what's expected you for this assessment. I think I've walked you through it pretty clearly. Again, if anything isn't clear, just reach out to me. It's absolutely fine. Just send me a quick question. What I have here is an FAQ. So these are some of the questions that have been asked in previous years. So I think it's useful to give you the answers to these questions now. So I'll work through these. So how should data be included? So I've told you need to be using the information that's in the case study resources, and some of this is data, some of it is results from lab tests and things like that. So how should you include this in your report? Simply, you just need to refer to the documents. So you just need to refer to the documents. So just in brackets, you refer to the document on the module space, and that's absolutely fine. So you just put the name of the document in brackets. This is the only data you should be using, so you shouldn't be needing to refer to primary data from elsewhere, from other sources. It should just be the information on the module space that you essentially need to interpret the case study. Is outside reading necessary? Yep, and this outside reading should be referenced. So to understand the case study, it is going to be really, really useful for you to do outside reading. particularly if you want to evaluate concepts, so you want to understand concepts in a really detailed way. So for example, some of the particular lab tests that are done, if you want to really understand these in detail, it would be really useful for you to go onto PubMed, find some research papers in which these tests are done, find some reviews of the lab test and other lab tests, because often for a particular infectious disease there'll be a review of all the different tests you can do, and if the particular lab test you're looking at might be included in that review. So if you're reading these resources, these would be really useful for you. Again, you won't need primary data from these, you won't need any lab test results from anywhere, all the results are on the module space. However, this wider information you can get from the literature, and you do need to reference this because of course you're getting it from the literature, so you need to reference the literature you've gotten it from. So you just reference this in the normal manner with a short reference list at the end of the microbiology portion of the submission. Okay, next, I don't understand the case study. So some students will just drop me an email saying they're a bit lost, and again, that's fine. If you're a little bit lost, the main thing is to make sure we can get you back on track. And the best way we can get you back on track is to make sure you look through, again, the resources on the module space. They're put there chronologically, so if you open up the microbiology tab on the module space, you'll see those 3 documents on the top, and in these 3 documents it is very, very clearly described what the purpose of the module is, what you are supposed to be doing, the different elements of the module are there and their context in relation to each other. So the first thing you need to do is read those documents, and you should see, okay, there's a case study and I need to read these resources and I need to watch these lectures and I need to write a report, and then hopefully it should come together. If you're finding you're stuck in terms of the technical aspects of the case study, so you're reading the information, you're reading the case study resources, the lab test results, etc., etc., and you're just not able to interpret it, then again, you need to be looking at the lecture recordings made by myself and Kate. You need to be watching this, and you need to be watching the other lecture recordings, so I'd encourage you to watch them. If you're still stuck, then you need to go into the outside reading, and that will provide you with some additional information. But all the information in those spheres, so with the lecture recordings and the other information on the module space and some outside reading, that should be all you need to get a complete 100% understanding of this case study. I don't understand what I have to do for the assessment. So again, this information is on the module space. A lot of this information is in this talk and in these slides. Again, if you think anything specifically isn't clear, just let me know. What is meant by evaluation? Evaluation means to discuss concepts and ideas critically in an intelligent and insightful way. So it's more than just saying this lab test means this. This population data means this. The fact the individual went here on this day means this. What evaluation means is going further and actually saying that critically, and actually being able to, for example, take a lab test and say the weaknesses of it and the strengths of it. And a lot of people tend to, when they're trying to evaluate, they tend to just lead into the weaknesses. So if they're talking about a particular lab test, so for example, you'll be looking at blood tests here. So counts, like you'll be looking at counts of blood cells. You could look at that and say, oh, these are the weaknesses of this. And that's fine, but you need to talk about the strengths as well. So evaluation isn't just poking holes and looking at the weaknesses, it's also looking at strengths, because it's about being balanced and it's about being objective and critical. Next, should I discuss cases not attributable to the epidemic? So when you're looking through the case study resources and when you're looking at one of the documents at the top which outlines the case study, you'll see that we're talking about 6 individuals, and it's suspected that these 6 individuals are they're ill, they're showing some kinds of symptoms, and it's suspected that their illness is attributable to the epidemic that we're discussing here. So this is what the case study is. It might not be the case that all 6 of these individuals are suffering from this particular causative agent. So some of these individuals might just happen to be ill with something else. Maybe all happen to be ill with something else, maybe none happen to be ill with something else, and all 6 are ill in a way that is attributable to the current epidemic. That's for you to decide. if you do decide some of the cases are not attributable to the epidemic, you still need to discuss them, and you need to explain why you believe that. So you need to put forward the evidence that supports that argument. However, because the focus of the submission is the epidemic, so it is the case study of the epidemic, if you've determined some individuals are not involved, you can, once you've argued that case, you can nudge them to the side a little bit, and the main focus should be the epidemic. Okay. Next up, should my lab data be used in the report? So no. So this is referring to the lab data you generate in the lab, because you should all be scheduled for one day in the lab to do some microbiology work. You don't need to include that information in your report. It's not expected, it's not necessary, you're not going to be awarded any marks for it. You're not going to be awarded any marks for coming to the lab either, though we do strongly encourage you to come to the lab if you can, because it'll be really useful for you, but you're not being awarded marks for it. Will I be awarded marks based on my lab performance? No. Again, when you're in the lab, you are there to learn some specific techniques and there to develop those specific techniques, but you're not being marked on that, and the assessment is separate from the work you're doing in the lab. Is there a 10% leniency regarding word count? Yep, so you can go 10% over the 720 word limit, that's absolutely fine, or up to 10% over, but if you exceed that, you will potentially have a mark penalty. Will marks be awarded for communication? Yep, so as with most submissions, you are given credit for good scientific communication, for whether or not the information you are communicated is communicated clearly and accurately. So we're talking about how good is your writing and your ability to communicate science through writing. We understand it's not an English language degree, and that's absolutely fine. So we're not looking for any artistic flair or anything like that. We just want it to be clear. We just want to understand the information you're communicating, because obviously to be a scientist, you need to communicate information clearly, whether that's verbally or through writing when you're submitting papers and things like that. So it is an important skill, and that's why it impacts submissions. Okay, so hopefully that's all clear. Again, if anything isn't clear, feel free to send me an email or a Teams message anytime, or to speak to me in person if you're in the lab this week. Okay, thank you.